Hello and welcome to episode 21 of the Green Bean podcast. My name is Katie Green and this is Jack, and we're both really glad that you're here joining us for this episode. If it's your first time, a very, very warm welcome to you, and if you've been here before, welcome back. Thank you so much for coming to visit with us again. We are recording this in my studio, which is in Devon in the southwest of England, and all of the extra footage that you're going to see in this episode was recorded during a walk out in Dartmoor National Park, which is really close to where we live. In this episode, I have got some drawing to share with you. I'm making a bit of progress towards producing my next issue of my zine, The Green Bean. I've also got a bit of knitting news and a new cast on to share with you, a new sewing project and a book review. So settle in with whatever you're working on and maybe a nice cuppa, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Today I'm working on a little comic about lichens, which will be for the new issue of my zine, The Green Bean. I'm just at the beginning of the process of putting this zine together, and I'm really enjoying it so far. If you follow me on Instagram, you will know that I'm utterly besotted and fascinated with lichens. Particularly, I like to spot them on my walks on Dartmoor. And it's just been really fascinating getting to dive into researching and learning more about them and translating that into illustrated form. So this little comic that I'm doing is going to be the first couple of pages that appear in the new zine, and it's a comic explaining what a lichen is, because even that is really fascinating. They might look like single organisms, like a plant, but they're actually a combination or a symbiosis of at least two, sometimes more, different organisms living and working together to colonise an environment that neither of them would be able to do on their own. And I think that is particularly fascinating. So I've been diving in and working on this comic and really, really enjoying it so far. So I'm working in one of my favourite mediums for comics, which is a Pigma Micron pen. I like the 01, which is 0.25 millimeters nib. I also like the 005, which is a narrower one for doing really fine details. And sometimes I use the 03 when I want a really thick line, so for panel borders or something like that. But if I was stranded on a desert island and could only ever have one pen, it would be a Pigma Micron 01 in black. And the paper I'm using is just a recycled photocopy paper. I like this because it is cheap, and using cheap paper means I'm not scared to make the first mark on it. Quite often when I'm using expensive watercolour paper, it can be a bit daunting and frightening when it costs upwards of £3 a sheet to make those first marks on it. But with cheap paper, I'm not precious about it, so it means I'm less afraid to get started on a big piece of work. So you're not sure how much you'll be able to see, but I've done a rough outline of this comic in pencil first, which is how I always begin. Or, well, I mean, I guess I begin with a storyboard in a sketchbook first, where I think through what I want the comic to say, and I break that down into individual pieces of information so I can plot it panel by panel, and figure out how to best get the information across on the page. And I love that aspect of comics. It's really like it's like a combination of problem solving and storytelling, and the like wrestling with those problems is something I find really, really satisfying about the process. The first couple of panels of this comic have got some close-ups of fingers in. Hands have always been something that I found particularly difficult to draw and would have avoided at all costs, but I'm now at the stage of my career where I don't think avoiding drawing anything in particular is appropriate. So I'm just making myself get on with it and not be afraid of drawing hands anymore. I remember at art college, I was so afraid of drawing hands that one of my tutors assigned me a project of doing an entire sketchbook full of hands. And I'd like to say that it improved my confidence, but it really didn't. It was very unpleasant. I did not enjoy it. I guess I could talk a little bit more about comics and how I got into reading comics and making comics, because it's actually not something that I grew up with. Although when I was a kid I definitely did want to be an illustrator, I kind of forgot about it during my teens, and I was steered in a more academic direction by my tutors at school, and I ended up studying biology at university, which sort of explains some of my fascinations with nature and lichens. I think you can see how biology ended up being the route that I went down, but I wasn't cut out for a career in academia at all, and I felt like the only other option open to me was teaching, and that wasn't something I wanted to do either. But it was just as I was finishing my biology degree that I picked up a picture book called The Red Tree by Sean Tan, and it just completely changed my life. That sounds such a cliche, but it's true. So I spent most of my teens thinking that books with pictures were for people who hadn't moved on to reading adult books. Do you know what I mean? Like that as you progressed and became a better reader, that you would move on to books that had fewer and fewer pictures. And yeah, because I was an adult and I could read well, that I didn't need books with pictures anymore. And I was so wrong about what pictures can offer. And from there I started thinking about using an illustrated format to tell the story of my recovery from eating disorders and abuse. And, you know, in the process of starting to research for Lighter Than My Shadow, I picked up other graphic novels, and it was like discovering that I could speak a whole new language. It was amazing. And yeah, this whole genre of literature opened up to me. And sorry, I'm hesitating on the word genre because it frustrates me. As a graphic novelist, they're often considered to be genre books, if you like, of fantasy and superheroes, and that's amazing. A lot of people are into that, but that's not the kind of comic that I enjoy. And it's kind of, I think it limits people's awareness of comics on other subject matters and in other genres like autobiography or science, or there's a whole array of different like journalism, comics, and amazing things to discover once you realise that comics is a language rather than a genre. So yeah, it's frustrating to find myself slipping up and using the word genre because that's not what I mean. But yeah, so comics have been a massive part of my life ever since then, and it's my preferred language for communicating about complicated things that I can't always get across in words. With my knitting, I have unfortunately a little bit of a sad tale to share with you, although if you follow me on Instagram or you've been hanging out in our Ravelry group, you will have already heard it, so don't worry, I haven't got more sad tales to tell. So I'm currently hosting a knit-along for the Seer Cloak by Maria Mascarella. We cast on winter solstice last year, and the plan was to knit until summer solstice this year. But my cloak has hit a little bit of a roadblock, so I, a few weeks ago, pulled out one of the yarns that I was going to use as a contrast colour, because I was planning to do some natural dyeing on it. I was going to dye it with some lichens that I had foraged on Dartmoor. And I found that the entire cone of yarn had been attacked by moths. So I was winding the yarn from the cone into a skein in order to dye it, and it was just breaking every metre or so. It was a disaster. And of course, when I looked closely at the cone, I saw that little bits had been nibbled from the outside into the centre of the cone, so the whole thing was damaged and useless. Now, I appreciate everybody who offered me advice on Instagram about dealing with moths. I have actually survived a really bad moth infestation in the past. Thankfully it was before I was a knitter, so I didn't have a stash to worry about, but I did have an entire wardrobe full of clothes and some pretty precious soft furnishings to worry about, and I unfortunately lost a lot of my textile possessions during that moth incident. So since then I've been super duper careful and anxious, and I actually store all of my yarn individually sealed in plastic bags. I don't have it out on display. I'm hyper vigilant about moths, and so I'm fairly sure that these moths arrived with the cone that the yarn was on, unfortunately. So that means that I've decided to discard not only that cone that was damaged, but the other 2 cones that were stored in the same bag, because I don't want to take any risks of bringing moths into our house again. Which does mean that it is the end of my Seer cloak as far as it had got, because I no longer have enough of the yarn I was using in order to finish it. So I do have a solution that I've been working on. I've ordered some cones of Swaledale yarn from Swaledale Woolens, which is an adorable little wool shop in the Yorkshire Dales that I visited a few times while I was on holiday there. So it still has that kind of personal connection and connection to a place that I really care about. That yarn is going to be a natural grey. So I'm discussing with Becky, who is a dyer at River Knits, to do a custom dyeing process on that for me, because obviously I will need a lot of yarn for a Seer cloak. So I'm going to commission her to dye those yarns to a lovely green colour for me. And as it turns out, when I did the River Knits dyeing workshop in December last year, we wrote down all of the recipes for the colours that we made in that workshop. So I actually have a recipe I can give her for just about the exact green that I want. So that's happening. That's going to take a little while, and also I actually need to step back and take some deep breaths and recover from that slight knockback with that project, shall we say. And something very interesting has happened, which is that I have cast on a comfort knitting project, which is a sock. Now, anyone who's been watching the podcast for a long time will know that I used to be vehemently not a sock knitter. I used to hate knitting socks. I used to have a terrible second sock syndrome. So to find myself gravitating towards a sock as a comfort knit is a surprise. But there are two things that are going on here that make it super comforting. Actually, there's more than two. But the first is the pattern. So the pattern I'm knitting is the Pebbles and Pathways socks by Marceline Smith, or you might know her from the Hey Brownberry podcast. And I have previously knitted these socks and frogged them because I didn't like the colour I was working with, or I changed my mind about it. So there's a comfort in it being a familiar pattern that I've knitted before. And what I love about the way that this pattern is written is that there's an interesting round where you have to do things to make the pattern, whether you do the cables and the other textured stitches, and then in between those rounds you get a plain round of just knitting, which is super relaxing. So it's a really nice mixture of knitting to hold your interest and relaxing knitting. Now, if you're familiar with the pattern, you'll notice that I have decided to knit top down, whereas the pattern specifies to knit toe up. That's just my personal preference, and I know that Mars is strongly in favour of people going their own way with her pattern. So yeah, I'm really enjoying them so far, and I'm much happier with this muted purple than I was with the pale pink that I originally knitted this project in. And it's definitely filling that gap of giving me something that feels quite quick to work on. I'm seeing instant progress, and that's comforting and soothing while I get over the blow that was my sear cloak. The yarn I'm using for this incarnation of my Pebbles and Pathways socks is a Viola sock yarn, one that I've had in my stash for a while. I'm a bit of a hoarder and collector of Viola yarns. I just absolutely adore her colours, and this particular one is actually a Eclipse colour. Eclipse is what Emily uses to name her one-of-a-kind colourways. So it doesn't have a name, and it's not a repeatable colour, but it's a lovely dusky purple with all different tones in it, and occasional splashes of bits of orange, and there's been a splash of pink in here. I've really enjoyed working with it, and I've already knitted a pair of socks out of Viola sock yarn in the past. It was my Bergen socks that I made last year. And I just love wearing them, and they're wearing really nicely. So I know that these are going to be a well-loved pair of socks when I finish them. After the last episode, I had a viewer request for me to talk a little bit about the needles that I like using, and I realised I hadn't actually mentioned my needles since some of the very earliest episodes of the podcast, and my preferences have changed quite significantly since then. So I was very much a knitter committed to wooden needles for a very long time. I really like the feeling of wooden needles in my hands, but as I've progressed over the last couple of years, I find myself knitting more and more projects at very fine gauges. Also, I'm a very loose knitter, so I tend to need smaller needles than a pattern recommends, which means in most cases I'm using needles that are smaller than 3mm. And anyone who's knitted with wooden needles smaller than 3mm will know that they have a tendency to break. And I was breaking a lot of needles because I'm a clumsy person. But the other thing I was finding is that I just couldn't get tips that were sharp enough. They were always a little bit blunt, and I was not enjoying working with them as much. So on the recommendation of my lovely friend Ella Austin, hi Ella, if you're watching, Ella is an amazing knitwear designer, and I really, really love her designs. She is the person who taught me about knitting my stranded colourwork inside out to help with the tension. That's a top tip from Ella. And it was also Ella who put me on to Chiaogu twist circular needles, particularly the mini interchangeables. And as far as I know, they're the only needle manufacturer that does an interchangeable circular needle for such tiny needles. I think all the others that only do interchangeables for sizes larger than 3mm, whereas the Chiaogu minis are, they have interchangeables for 2.5mm down to tiny, tiny needles, smaller than you would really need. I think the smallest one I've got is a 1.5mm. And that's been my needle of choice for almost all of my knitting lately. They've got a nice pointy tip but not too sharp, and I love the quality of this red cable. It I don't know whether you say it either does have a memory or it doesn't, but it doesn't get kinks in it like some circular needle cables do, so it's really, really nice to work with. And since I started using these, I haven't really wanted to knit with anything else. So this is my first sock of the pair, and I'm knitting it very much according to what I've established as my preferences for sock knitting. So that's top down with a 2x2 rib cuff. Then I've followed the main pattern from Pebbles and Pathways down to the heel. I've done a heel flap with a slip stitch pattern. And at the moment I'm just working on the gusset decreases down to the toe, where I will do a barn toe, which is my preferred way of finishing, both because it fits my foot better and because I have a great distaste for Kitchener stitch. And when I discovered the barn toe, it revolutionised my attitude to sock knitting, because it meant that I didn't need to do Kitchener stitch anymore. I'm about halfway through my current sewing project, which is making a wearable muslin for a pair of trousers from a Birder sewing magazine. That felt like it was a very long sentence. I picked out this pair of trousers because I feel like it's time for me to brave trousers again, both in terms of sewing, but also in terms of wearing them. If you're interested why I'm scared of wearing trousers, you can scroll way back through my Instagram. There's a little comic about it that I made a few years ago. But trousers represent various challenges in terms of my body image and also in terms of my sewing, because they present fitting challenges that dresses don't. I'll also have to sew in a zip and fit a waistband and all of those things. So obviously I needed to make a muslin first. I couldn't just wing it and start cutting into my fancy fabric. So I picked a organic cotton fabric from my stash that I like but I don't love. It's a double gauze, so it's kind of soft, and it is continuing my theme of sewing muslins with fabric that's not the easiest to work with. It's a check, so in theory it should be really easy to line up the grain, but because it's a double gauze it's kind of wibbly wobbly, and anyway, I didn't waste loads of time being super precise with it because it is at the end of the day just a muslin. And the stage I'm at now is that I've sewn both of the legs separately, so they're not sewn together. I have two single legs of the trousers that I've tried on, and I'm pretty happy with the shape of them, but I think that it's going to be too big around the waist. I made the size that was recommended based on my waist measurement, but holding them up on myself and holding them where I think they're going to fit once the waistband is on, I think they're going to be about 3 inches too big, which is massive. Obviously I won't know until I've sewn them together and attached the waistband, so I am going to go ahead and do that just because it's good practice as well. I've never constructed a fly before, or you know, it's just good to practice those techniques before you do them on your final garment. So that's my next bit of sewing that I have to do, is finish those trousers and assess how bad the misfitting is and whether I'm going to readdress it in that muslin and give them another fitting, or whether I'm confident that I can make the adaptations and take them straight to my my fashion fabric, which is going to be a green corduroy. I'm pretty excited about owning a pair of green cords, and I can just see them going with my dinosaur shirt that I made recently. So it's going to be a good outfit when it gets there, but I've got a little bit more work to do on them first. As always lately, I wanted to finish this episode by sharing a book with you that I've enjoyed lately. And as I waffled on about how much I love comics at the start of this episode, it seemed only fitting that I should pick a graphic novel to share with you. And it's good timing because I've just finished reading an excellent one, and that is Genderqueer by My Oku Barbie. This is a graphic memoir, very in a similar vein to my own graphic memoir, Lighter Than My Shadow, and it's actually published by Lionforge, which are my US publishers, which is how I came across the book first, and it had been on my reading list for ages, so I'm really glad that I finally had the chance to pick it up. It is a account in comics of Maya's growing up and experiences as a transgender person, or somebody who does not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. And it's fantastic and fascinating, and a real testament to the power of comics and Maya's talent with comics to express things that are difficult to express any other way. It's hard to put my finger on exactly what it is, but something about the combination of words and pictures makes those difficult subjects more accessible. Now, I'm not sure how this book was written. It definitely has a episodic kind of feel to me, as though it maybe was initially published as a webcomic or in smaller instalments. But the effect of that is that it makes it easy to read. You can pick it up and put it down, or as I did, just crawl into bed on a wet Saturday afternoon and read it from cover to cover without putting it down. I just loved it. It's an amazing combination of like really raw and truthful writing, like really emotional, but also it's got some lighthearted and funny bits, and something for everybody to identify with. Obviously, folks who are experiencing difficulty with their gender will identify with it, but there's loads of tidbits about growing up and pop culture, and Maya happens to be a very big Harry Potter fan, so I enjoyed that aspect of the book as well. Fantastically relatable and beautifully drawn, and I really, really recommend it if you can get hold of a copy. boy. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Green Bean podcast. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the various projects I've been working on. I certainly enjoy getting to share them with you by making these videos. Huge thanks to everybody who supports the podcast on Patreon. You are what make this possible, and I hope that you're enjoying the extra videos and vlogs that you have access to over there. If you'd like to think about supporting the podcast, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Katie Greenbean. If you want to catch us between now and next time, the best place to do so is on Instagram or Ravelry, where I'm also at Katie Greenbean. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Take care. Bye.